What if the future king's squire and a struggling songstress teamed up to solve a medieval murder? Jill Williamson debuted her first fantasy, By Darkness Hid, in April 2009. Since then, she has written many dozens of books across fantasy, sci-fi, and teen spy genres. Now she is returning to the Blood of Kings world for Squire of Truth, which released last week. And today she joins our podcast to answer the question, what is medieval fantasy?
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Hark, fellow servants of the King! Welcome to Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com in which we explore fantastical stories for our King's glory. I am Eastemer Burnett. I publish Lorehaven.com. I'm also the author of a non-medieval fantasy but awesome science fiction adventure launching in March, 2 months from now, from Enclave Publishing, called Above the Circle of Earth.
And I'm Zackary Russell, and in my house, I only have one sword, so I don't think that's enough for Jesus, if you know the reference. But hopefully it's enough for this episode, 245, What is Medieval Fantasy? And we'll be talking soon with Jill Williamson.
This episode begins our new series for this year, probably throughout this year, but certainly a lot of it in the first quarter of this year, called Jesus in Every Genre. We've decided to take all of those subgenres of fantasy, science fiction, supernatural, and all the various hybrids of those and ask, how do we find Jesus in here? Where is he glorified? What's amazing about these stories? What are notable examples of these stories, especially from Christian authors, including our upcoming guest, Zach? I like fantasy. I like sci-fi. I think I like all of these genres. There may be a few subgenres that are coming up here that I'm not necessarily going to prefer, but I'm really looking forward to surveying these and asking experts in the field about what kinds of stories these are.
Yep. I mean, I got started out in all of this with Dragonlance, so back in 6th grade or something. So I'm still a fan of fantasy. I still read and listen to it. Stephen, do you have a sword in your house? Do we have 2 swords total?
I'm trying to think whether I have. I used to have many, many swords. Well, technically they were my brother's swords, and technically they were all replicas from the Lord of the Rings film trilogy, a Glamdring, a Sting, a Ranger sword, a bunch of those. I had a Gandalf the White staff, which you would not part an old wizard from his walking stick. Maybe Glamdring was mine. I don't remember. They're kind of stuck at the homestead right now, unfortunately. But a chap can never have too many swords decorating the walls, maybe even brought down and used for practical purpose in case some foul miscreant comes along.
Well, to quote Jesus in Luke 22, it is enough. So I think we've met our quota.
The real
to Jesus,
sword is the word of God. I forgot.
There we go. So we've got that as well.
Yeah. It is, after all, the sword of truth, which is the word of God. But books are also very cool, as well as swords. Speaking of books, by the way, another thing we're doing this year is we're going to give away some books. We want you to share this episode, in particular of the podcast, and thanks in part to Jill's publisher, Sunrise Publishing, a blessed listener, or 2 actually, for this episode, will be getting a physical copy of Squire of Truth, one of 2. And then you will also get a bookplate signed by our guest, Jill Williamson, to stick inside. But what do you have to do? You have to share this episode on social media. Share it loudly. One entry per person, rather, but share it as often as you like on Facebook, on Instagram, and on X. And you just need to tag Lorehaven and mention Squire of Truth. Tag us, mention Squire of Truth as you share this episode. You've got 1 week from the release date of this episode, which is Tuesday, January the 14th. And then we will announce the winner about 1 week from today. Not in our next episode, because we've already recorded it, but in the episode after that. Anyhow, you want Squire of Truth, which, by the way, coming up is our top sponsor, or bottom sponsor, actually, and then there'll be a top sponsor. Mission update at Lorehaven 2. We're talking about another author there of fantasy with a lot of medieval in it, Mr. Sanderson. Zach, I don't know how well I did with that, but Brandon Sanderson has a new book out.
It'll do.
We have 2 articles out about it. We may not be as fast as him, but we try. Josiah DeGraff wrote an article called The Stormlight Archive Recites a Creedal View of Morality. Then A.D. Sheehan wrote another article more about the controversy around Wind and Truth. He said, Brandon Sanderson's new fantasy, Wind and Truth, summons a postmodern cringe storm. So there's some positive aspects there of the story, and there's also some stuff that people are not too kind about, are not too happy about. And you can get those articles now at lorehaven.com. Subscribe free. We'll email you whenever those articles release, as well as the podcast episodes and other news. Our top sponsor for this episode is returning champion Enclave Publishing with Oasis Family Media and their new book by Clint Hall, our next podcast guest, by the way, Echo Nova. It releases next week. Dash Keen is about to become the biggest star in history. As a poor teenager living in the dregs, Dash Keen can only escape his dismal reality by competing in illegal rooftop races and staying up late to watch the TimeNet with his younger brother. When there is an opportunity to participate in a competition set thousands of years in the past, he uses his rooftop racer skills to catch the eye of Mr. Mertram, head of entertainment for the massive Dominus Corporation. It is the chance of a lifetime when Dominus Corp hires Dash to be a time star, the focus of his own series in which he must survive some of the most dangerous periods in history, including the Cretaceous, feudal Japan, the Wild West, and the golden age of piracy. But when empathy for the people of the past conflicts with the desires of his new employer, he must decide whether the price of fame is worth it, a decision that may cost him everything. Enclave Escape presents Echo Nova by Clint Hall, available now wherever fantastic books are sold. Ask for it at your favorite bookseller or your local library, or order it online at Amazon or at enclavepublishingstore.com. It's also available in audio from Oasis Audio. You can see that cool cover in the show notes for this episode 245, or for that in the complete archive of the podcast, go to lorehaven.com/podcast. We just did a little time travel of our own because I know how to say the name of Mr. Mertram, whereas in your future listener, I'll be working around that pronunciation. But for a more linear mode of storytelling, we're going to go to Jill Williamson. But first, we need to wake her up. She's out in the Vale. She's doing Vale Warrior type things. Jill, are you there? Jill, are you there? No more blood voicing. This is podcast time.
Hello. Sorry. I was very busy out in the Vale.
I understand it gets a little clamorous out there with all of that blood voicing going on. Now, I remember blood voicing because I was an OG reader of your first novel, By Darkness Hid. The hero had to do a lot of suffering there, and that's probably why his name is Aiken, as I recall. We'll start it off with a terrible dad joke. You all can read more about Jill in the show notes, but she's got a new book out now that is called Squire of Truth. Jill, I want to ask you a one trick question going in. Who would win in a fight between telepathic knights and aliens?
A fight between telepathic knights and aliens? Well, what skills do the aliens have?
You do need to know about the power levels. Zach, you want to make up some aliens for us real quick? You're the aliens guy.
We'll just do the classic gray aliens. You know, those like 3.5 foot tall, scrawny, big head, big eyes.
Probably demons.
Yeah. The telepathic knights are going to win because they'll just get in their heads and give them massive headaches.
They're
and
very
they're
big
bigger,
heads.
So the headaches will hurt more.
Yep.
That'll definitely hurt. Yep.
That is some sound rationale there. We'll just assume that these gray aliens do not have telepathic powers or demon powers because, they're actually demons. But we'll deal with that in the sci-fi episodes. Jill, I also wanted to tell you, and maybe you've forgotten this, and I will admit, I did too. Believe it or not, back in the old days of Speculative Faith, there was an original, air quotes, podcast attempt between me and you. I think we got on Skype. I tried to record it. I tried to self-host it on the website. I didn't know anything about how to get it out to podcast players. I don't even know if we had mobile devices or podcast players back then. But I will link that in the show notes, and then we can see how well we did back in, what is this, 2011? Was I trying this in 2011? That is hilarious. I think I knew there was a thing called podcast. April 15, 2011, I tried to interview you for the Portal podcast, which was never a thing. I think that may have been the beginning and ending of the most short-lived Christian Fantastical podcast in history. And now we're at 245 episodes of this podcast.
Well, I'm glad I got a second attempt.
Yes, and I'm glad that this definitely helped relaunch your career, which is going really well, by the way. Let's go to chapter 1 and talk about your entry into the medieval fantasy world. So kind of traveling back to the past is what it's about. By Darkness Hid, released in 2009, and it was followed by 2 sequels. And then you did some other books. You did the teen spy books, and then you've done a lot of fantasy books, some really big ones too. Before going back to the Blood of Kings world for Squire of Truth, and then more books coming on the way. How did the Blood of Kings series get its origin, and what back then was this whole Christian-made fantastical movement like in the mid-2000s?
I got the idea for this book I shoved it together with 2 things. The first was that I had a random dream, and it was a sci-fi dream, and I ended up switching it over from blasters to swords. So, but originally it was that, and there was this city, and there was this woman trying to get this person out, and she knew he wasn't who he thought he was. That's really all that was important about that dream. And then I saw a house that had burned down partly, and there was a tree in the yard, and the tree that was inside the fence where the house had burned was dead and burned, and the tree hanging over the sidewalk was green and leafy and blowing in the wind. And I was really just taken by the image of this half dead, half living tree, and ran home and photoshopped it. And then I started thinking about a world that was half dark, like there was a curse or there was something that was just darkness was growing across the land. And that went on, I just traveled with that metaphor a bit and ended up thinking, okay, because people have been turning their hearts from God and going their own way, and there's this curse growing, and that's where it started. And I drew a map, of course, because I thought, oh, have to have a map. I hate when I pick up a fantasy novel and there's no map in the front. Like, why? So I drew a map, and I instantly started thinking about the characters, and it got big, way too big. I got lost in story world builder's disease long before I even wrote a word. My husband called me on it when I was doing fashion sketches of my characters and their outfits. And I had this big 3-ring binder. But eventually he said, I thought you were writing a book. So I started writing the book, and I did. It was By Darkness Hid. I was calling it Blood Voices at the time. And it was the 6th novel I completed before being published, and the first one that sold. And I had actually paid Jeff Gerke to do a freelance edit on my Spy Kid novel, The New Recruit, which was my first book ever. I kept getting requests for the full, and it wouldn't sell, and I wanted to know what was wrong with it. And so he did a great job, and I was really respected him. So when I went to a Christian Writers Conference, and again, and this was kind of how it was back then, nobody ever wanted to look at young adult or sci-fi fantasy. Nope. No agents, no editors wanted to see it. It was really hard to get anyone to look at it. And I wanted to try to sell to Zondervan or Thomas Nelson. That was really, I knew they had published Anita K. Paul, and they had published, I had a short list of people they had published at the time, Brian Davis's publisher, but they were also doing some teen fantasy. But anyway, they weren't at this house. No one wanted to see it at this Oregon Christian Writers Conference, but Jeff Gerke was there. And so I thought, you know what, I'll see what he thinks of my new fantasy story. And so I gave him my cover letter, just how you do. Oregon Christian Writers set their conference up very similar to how Mount Hermon used to do it, where you could choose 3 proposals to put in to 3 people. And it was part of the fee to attend. It was great because for introverted people who didn't like to go up and cold pitch, you could just use your words. And so I did that. I gave it to an agent and to Jeff and to Dan Penwell. He used to be in charge of Brian Davis's publishing house. Point being, Jeff, I didn't realize had started a publishing house. I guess I did. I think I heard about it, but it didn't occur to me that he would have any interest in my story. But he did. Turns out he had wanted a fantasy story. He had a sci-fi. He was going to release 3, and he was looking for a fantasy, and so that's what happened. He wanted to publish it, and I was like, he said, "Is it finished?" That was his first question, because at conferences you get a lot of things from authors who aren't finished yet, and it's brilliant, but they're not done, and you have to be able to get to the end of your book if you're going to get published. So that was his question, and then he wanted to read the whole thing, and I got the phone call. I was very excited. actual phone call from an editor.
Hey, phone calls are cool. Emails are pretty cool too, but a phone call, that's very cool. See, this was back then in the days before email. No, not really. But it was in the days before
Almost.
mobile phones. It was in the days when still online bookstores were in their infancy. And by then, I don't even remember whether we had anything more than the hope of digital books and mobile devices, dedicated e-reader devices. But one thing that helped more of this Christian-made fantasy get published was this whole print on demand thing, where folks could roll off smaller batches of books at a more economic cost. So just a little behind the scenes detail there. That was a big reason why Marcher Lord Press, now called Enclave Publishing, and a bunch of other smaller publishers, as well as a bunch of indie authors, were able to get started. So Jill, you're there at the time. I'm curious though about the genre. You said that the original images that led to this universe were science fiction, but you switched it to fantasy. Do you remember any exact reason there, or did it just seem to work better with the story that was coming together based on those early images?
Well, I'll be honest. I think I was afraid of writing sci-fi. I adore um, Star Wars and Star Trek and all of that. And I don't think I really understood the differences genre-wise between the two. Like I didn't understand space fantasy at the time and realized that I could make stuff up. I think I was worried that throughout my career, the times I've written sci-fi books, I really am stressed because I'm just not super good at some of that research stuff, the science and the math, and I don't want to get it wrong. Super stressed when I wrote Replication, super stressed when I wrote The Safelands, which I didn't think was going to be sci-fi, but there was a disease and I had to have this kid try to figure out how to cure a disease. And I was like, oh no, I've done it again. I'm stuck. I have to make this has to work, you know? But in fantasy, like Jeff told me, I remember being at a writer's conference and a reader came up to me and he was like, why is your world shrouded in darkness? You have to know why. And I was like, I do. And he was talking about
That's a sci-fi reader
in the ground that were spewing ash and how it could be dark. And it was so cool. I went and found Jeff and I told him the whole story and he said, Jill, you're writing fantasy. It is because you say it is. If you're writing sci-fi, right, then yes, you need to know about the ash or whatever thing you want to make up. And he said, but you're fine. You're writing fantasy. And I was like, okay, cool. So I think part of the reason I gravitated toward that genre is because then my imagination was in charge and I didn't have to stress. I still really do love getting facts right. Like I've had people write me and say that I got all my herbs correct for my girl who's a healer. And I did that research. So I do want to have that realistic element that, makes that all of it ring true and possible, but I gravitate toward to that.
But it just is that way. I mean, because that's what fantasy is. It's like, nope, we're not going to explain. There's no science textbooks. There's no biology or astronomy books to explain all this. That's the way it is. Yeah, the guy that talked to you that said that is probably a sci-fi reader like me. Because my first thought when you said, "Oh, the world is half dark," I'm like, "Oh, so it's like a tidally locked planet like Proxima B, the closest exoplanet to the Earth." Which we'll probably talk about next week in our episode. We're going to talk next week about hard and soft sci-fi and and Star Trek and Star Wars. We're going to get into all that next week, listener. So just hang on. But yes, in fantasy, you have the freedom to just create a world, and it can have its own rules, and you don't have to explain all the rules. It's deep magic. We weren't there when it was written. It just is that way.
Obligatory Narnia reference there. I will say, and I think more in the next chapter, that there is a little bit of a higher expectation for medieval fantasy, and that is the broad catch-all term that I would use, at least based on the first 3 books of the Blood of Kings universe. Jill, it's very medieval, and yet it's grown into these other spin-offs now. The new series is called Blood of Kings Legacy, and the first installment there is called Squire of Truth, which is out now. And of course, listener, you can win a copy. How did this thing grow into a larger universe? Were there some spin-offs I missed in the meantime? Because I know you wrote a lot of other fantasy books. What are some examples of novels that you've written that count as part of this universe or as part of the medieval fantasy overall term?
Well, the original trilogy. And then I wrote a Varel Sparrow prequel novella that I put out last summer. And I really, really wrote that to eventually have a new kind of a lead magnet to give away, because the one I was giving away was like historical fantasy and I didn't feel like it met readers' expectations. But so I wrote that little girl story. It's a prequel. It happens right before she goes into hiding and dresses up like a boy. The Bethany House trilogy that I did, the Kinsman Chronicles, was an ancient prequel. So that's 500 years in the past, and it's how the kings got to the land of Eret. So it's not medieval; it's more ancient. It kind of parallels like a Judah, Jerusalem type of a world where kings are doing evil in the eyes of the Lord and all this kind of stuff. So that's what that series is. And eventually they do get to Eretz, and I had fun trying to create what would become the two types of magic. I wrote where these original kinsman people were given that gift of telepathy and were like, what is happening? And figuring out how to use it. So that was really fun. And then now these books with Sunrise. And this was Susie May Warren's idea. She had read The Blood of Kings back in the day. Her kids had read it, and she wanted a fantasy line at Sunrise and called me up and said, hey, Jill, do you want to play with us? She says, it doesn't have to be The Blood of Kings if you would really rather write in a different world, but I could kind of read between the lines that she liked that series and the medieval fantasy world. And so I was game. Yeah, let's do it. Let's have more stories, because when you create a world that's so big, there's room for so much more than you can sometimes do in just 3 books, which is where the prequel came from. So yeah, that's all I've written so far. Technically, I wrote on my Patreon, I wrote a prequel story for Cole, who's my character from Squire of Truth, because I wanted to get to know him more. And so this story parallels the second half of To Darkness Fled and all of From Darkness One, which is my book 2 and 3 in the original trilogy, but from Cole's point of view, and this guy Kurtz, who's this kind of a wild knight, troublesome knight, as their friends. And it was so fun. And the thing that was really fun about it was Susie's idea, because I wasn't sure who to write about. She wanted me to kick off this new series for my authors, and I can explain that in a minute. But she was like, what about this Cole character? And I thought, well, he's only 14. Now, the thing to know about Sunrise is they're a romance publisher. So these are medieval fantasies, but they each need to have a romance piece in these books, because this is a romance publisher. So these are fantasy action adventure stories with romance. So I'm like, I always saw him as 14, but when I went back and read the story, I never said how old he was. So I thought it'd be really funny if he's just a really short kid who's like 19, and that if Aiken finds out that this kid was actually older than him, and Aiken's been trying to take him under his wing all this time, and this kid's like 3 years older than him. I just thought it'd be funny when Aiken finds that out. And that's what started that whole thing of, okay, I'm going to write about this guy. And so I do have a prequel story that I someday will probably put out about Cole, which parallels those books. And it was really fun to write from a different point of view.
And what is the blood voicing? Is that the telepathy? Is that the magic in this book? Okay.
Blood voicing is a telepathic magic, and it's more than just telepathy. You can actually, different people have different levels of ability, like one would with anything, but you can actually also kind of shift out of your body and into the veil, which would be the world between worlds. If you and people can see other people there. And I'm actually in the new books experimenting with. Now we've had in the Kinsman Chronicles in my Bethany House series, they were able to see demons, and so in our new books, we're experimenting with the idea of angelic beings as well being there, which is really kind of fun to play with. I never really got into much of that I didn't get into that at all in Blood Kings, but if you're in the world between worlds, that's where those beings would be. And so it stands to reason that some of these people with this magic would be able to see them.
Blood voicing has always been a fascinating concept. I'm now even more fascinated with the idea of these analogous spiritual entities also hovering around in the void. It makes sense where they would go after all. Jill, you mentioned that very catch-all buzzword, romantasy, which is kind of all on trend right now. We're going to talk about that hopefully in an episode next month. But there is overlap then between medieval fantasy and romantasy. So in the next chapter, let's talk about what exactly medieval fantasy is associated with, the pictures that we have coming into our heads. However, we first have a different kind of fantasy to share with you, and that is Garden of Mysteries, a Dragon Slayer Bible story, new middle grade biblical fiction with a fantastical twist by Lori Christine, our next sponsor. An ancient curse, an invisible dragon, a mysterious prophecy. Seth's parents have secrets they won't share with him. Why did the king kick them out of the garden and curse the land? And can the curse be broken? Finding answers to Seth's questions will prove more dangerous than he imagined. Can he discover the truth before the dragon destroys him. Frank Peretti meets the chosen for kids in this adventure-packed middle grade novel that will inspire readers to identify lies of the dragon and to put their trust in Jesus, the dragon slayer. Garden of Mysteries, a dragon slayer Bible story, is now available for purchase on Amazon. Also, be sure to check out the companion devotional for Garden of Mysteries, sold separately on Amazon. Learn more at dragonslayerbible.com and see the cool cover and the links in our show notes for this episode 245. Jill, some medieval imagery there, or at least kind of alluding to the series that you mentioned with Bethany House, kind of pre-medieval there, pre-medieval when you're talking about the Garden of Eden, the king, an eviction, a sacred garden, a paradise lost, and of course a dragon on the prowl. Dragons are part of medieval fantasy traditionally because they're part of those old legends that in the Western world give birth to the medieval fantasy genre. That's the Arthurian legend, I think, is the earliest example there. Maybe not as early as people would like to think, but it is pretty early. And that gives us really the tropes that are associated with medieval fantasy: castles and kings, knights, horses, serfdoms, wizards, blood voicing. Well, see, though, now there's a new thing here, and that's what makes it fun too, is that generally there's a sense of magic too in medieval fantasy. Someone's got the magic, whether it's a natural law magic that everyone can get to, or whether it's someone like Merlin or people of a particular bloodline that have a particular ability, like a blood voicing. Some medieval fantasy stories are heavier on the medieval. I know that Chuck Black has stories about Knights of the Round Table without a lot of magic in there. Some readers are not as comfortable with magic, and so they like these kinds of stories. And then others are more light on the medieval and heavier on the magic. And then you get epic fantasies with that medieval tint, but it's much more separated, like from this Arthurian legend. You may not even see a single castle. Maybe they have a different place for the kings to hole up in, or a different idea of knighthood. But Blood of Kings, I mean, that's it. It does feel very medieval. I think there's even a castle on the cover. There are knights, telepathic knights. There are swords and sword fights. And that's why I do need to say that you do got to do some research if you're going to do medieval fantasy. You can't just make everything up, even if it's internally consistent. You said that you researched herb lore. Lots of authors research the exact ways that you could get stabbed with a sword, and some of the myths that we get from movies. Like, it does count, and it feels authentic to the genre and a tribute to those original Arthurian legends for you to do the research about what knights were behaving like in Earth history or Earth legend, even if they don't have your specific custom brewed magic system.
Absolutely. I had a lot of fun researching. My first draft, Jeff said, I had my old knight teaching the young boy how to use his sword. And my editor said, I'm not sure you got this right. Where did you learn this? And I was like, I made it up. He said, why don't you go find some books on that, Jill? I also had to research medieval armies, how they move, what's a rear guard, all this stuff I had no concept of. I did really. So I read tons and tons of books, medieval swordmanship, books on how our armies are structured. And it takes a really long time to move a medieval army. They're on horseback, and there's trees, and they're on a trail, and there's thousands of them. And they don't just zap from one town to the next. So much stuff I researched in that. And jousting, I had a tournament. I remember looking, even just the pictures in some of the books I read for kids, like there were these dogs under the table eating scraps. And I was like, oh, I got to have dogs in the Great Hall. Right. And I had a ton of fun with it. My authors who are writing books in this world now, and I have caught so many mistakes. So I'm just going to out myself. You never think you're writing a book and that someday people are going to mine it and just dissect it to infinity, and we still don't know which city has spoons and doesn't have spoons. Like, is there silverware in Arrett's? We're not. I used to say no. People are eating on trenchers, but then then there was a bowl in my book. Like, I don't know where the bowl came from. I forgot that we were on trenchers. So it's funny to me to catch the things that just slipped through because they were big books and we were focusing on the story and the world was there, but there's pieces here and there that don't add up, which is fine. It's a bigger world. These cities may have different levels of technology than these cities, and they're using stone bowls, and over here they've invented some kind of pottery. I don't know, but the research was still really fun, and I've always loved the medieval genre. I know that there's trends now to have so many different worlds, and I think that's lovely. But I still will always love that European fantasy. That's just something that I grew up on, and I love, and I know readers still like it. So I'm happy to keep writing more stories in that world. And there is a very romantic piece to it too, with the knights and the chivalry and stuff like that.
You talked about how do armies march, and I've always heard the phrase armies march on their stomachs, and so it's all about the food and the supply lines, and that's what makes one army successful over another. And I always appreciate in books when they mention anything about food. So do you get into the food? Is there like a local cuisine? Do they have like certain types of flavors? Anything like particular to this world that you get into?
I did that a very little in the original series, and as they go to different places, I mention it's a fishing town or things like that. Some of the spices and some of the other southern cities I put there.
Another aspect of medieval fantasy, in particular that European tradition, Arthurian legend, and the like, is the element of faith in the cultures. Arthur is tied in with a very strong presence of the church, going back to those original legends, because the church, and really there was kind of only one, and a lot of Christians have issues with that, but it was a presence in those legends, even with Morgana Le Fay and the magic going on, and some of the mixing in of some pre-Christian or less Christian elements there. There was this idea of God. There was this idea, Jill, you mentioned of chivalry, a code of honor for these knights. And if they follow it, great. You get basically turned into a superhero in later accounts of you. A lot of exaggeration happening there. And if you don't, then you get turned into a cautionary tale, a really serious cautionary tale. Loose lips and lack of chivalry and a respect for the wife of the king will destroy an entire kingdom. So it's just assumed there some biblical virtue in the worldview of the story. And so it is also presumed in the worldview of Blood of Kings. Now, this isn't a story set in this earth, but because it inherits and is inspired by those medieval traditions, God and Judeo-Christian virtue are just a presumed element of that world. And I presume then, too, that because you're a Christian, that got into the story from the ground floor. You didn't have to set out to say, I'm going to do a Christian medieval story. All you have to do is do a medieval story. And if you're faithful to those originals and inspired by them, then that version of Christian culture is going to work itself in naturally.
It did. I thought it did. I had that, the light versus darkness theme going on, and I had kind of a loose plan of where I was going. When Jeff read the first book, though, he wanted more. He wanted to be a little more overt. He's like, well, how is this Christian? And I was like, well, and I explained my thoughts, and he said, well, we need to up it. And the way that I upped it was by adding Armand's voice. Armand is the name for God in my world. And in the Blood of Kings, I use Hebrew words for most of the old language kind of thing. So Armand is a word that I chose for God's character. I let my boy, my main character boy, hear Armand's voice. As he was learning to discover his telepathy magic and hearing all these random voices, he heard this other voice. And so that piece is what came in once I signed with Jeff in Martial Law Press and was working to edit and revise to publish it. And so that is the piece that I added, but I did still have all of those things that you talked about, and even the themes of chivalry and not every knight was chivalrous by any means. And so I did show both sides of that, but I had different versions of the religion as well. It was the world I created was also a little bit like there were gods for this and that. There was the god of beauty and the god of protection, and all these people had different temples in different cities for different gods. But my particular knight that meant sort of to mentor my main character followed what he called was the way. And some people thought that was, hooey and all this kind of thing, but they were following basically my version of Christianity, Protestant Christianity in that story. And so they followed Armand only and not those other gods. And so I had that going on in the background of the story world as my character went through and found his way. And then I had also characters who just were side characters, which is what made us able to write new books, because I left so many side characters with unknown stories that readers wanted to know. One of these examples is Lady Tara, who was a young lady who very much impressed my main character boy by being kind to him when she knew he was nothing but a slave. And so later, when he's supposed to think of someone to marry, he thinks of this girl. And then he finds out she's already been married off to this really, really old dude. And he's shocked and annoyed and angry. Like, how could her father marry her to this old dude? And he was like, well, because it's darkness in the frozen north, and they needed food, and they got a deal to trade food, and she got married off to him. And so that's some of the medieval reality that I brought in. Not all of it was beautiful and chivalrous. It was a hard life. It was a hard way to live. And so those are interesting themes to play with too in that kind of a story, because then how does someone, who gets married off to this old guy still love God?
I like that you're focusing on that realism aspect, because realistically we value chivalry because not everyone has it, because it is rare. It's the same way with heroism. It's all these things are like on a bell curve, right? Like the middle of the bell curve is just people keeping to themselves, minding their own business, not helping out, not getting involved, just kind of staying away from any kind of trouble. And it's the chivalrous person, the heroic person that's like small part of the bell curve that's like, all right, I'm going to get involved and do something about this and be more self-sacrificial and more noble. I also really like that you have a world with many different religions, and people are sort of debating their religion, and then there's the way, there's the one true God. And I think that's what I go through these phases, Jill, where I read a lot of sci-fi and I'm like, this just isn't really doing it for me, and I don't quite know why. And then I'll pick up a fantasy book. I'm like, oh yeah, it's just normal in fantasy for people to talk about spirituality. It's not so normal in sci-fi. In fact, it really stands out when people do it, because a lot of sci-fi, especially a lot of modern sci-fi, is kind of built on this idea of, oh, if we just have technology, then we don't need God. We can figure out the secrets of the universe. We can master the secrets of the universe, and we don't need God. And a lot of very classic sci-fi authors have directly come out and said this, that, this scientific theory, this certain technology, we don't need God if we have this. And so it's a little trickier to introduce religion in sci-fi, and that's probably why it's even rare in Christian publishing. But you're right in that fantasy fits really well with Christian publishing. And we might have someone listening to the show that they love Christian fiction, but maybe they haven't read a lot of fantasy in general, much less Christian fantasy. And I think you've given them a way to really understand what it is you're trying to do there. When you've got, a reader at first glance might see the magic or might see the gods and think, well, what in the world is this? Like, how does this mesh with a Christian worldview? Well, that actually is a Christian worldview, that people are inescapably religious. I mean, I think of Acts 17, where Paul goes to this temple. There's all these different gods, and there's one to the unknown God, just like, hey, we just want to cover our bases because we might have missed something here. That is the nature of man, to be seeking something religious and spiritual, but then to be a real God that's behind it all. So I love that you've put that in your story, and that fits so naturally with the fantasy story. So I'll bet you had a lot of fun creating all of that in these different religious systems. And are there like, maybe not like Act 17 style debates, but are there like religious kind of debates, or is there evangelism? Are there missions? Like how do those things interact in your world?
Well, subtly. I had a scene with my girl who's dressed up as a boy. She gets taken by these knights who think they sense her magic and they want to train her and use her, and she doesn't. She's just hanging out. But she prays for her food, and then one of them makes fun of her for that, and the other one shuts down the debate right there. But there's just a couple lines where why would you pray? Why wouldn't you thank the God of food for your food? Why Armand? Why do you pray to him? That kind of a thing. And then I did actually get some annoyed, probably non-believing readers in book 2, because I needed my boy to meet God. And so I needed to get him some information about God. And so I added what I called was a Teshua service, which was kind of just like a church service in a home. And so I wrote a whole church service into a book, which is usually a no-no, but I needed to show the readers how he needed to see it, or he wasn't going to become a follower of the God. And I got away with. Some people love that scene, and some people think, oh, this turned into a church book. And I understand that some readers did not see. Like my book got books 1 and 2 both were listed in Voya's Voice of Youth Advocates, which is a general market teen periodical for libraries, and they were listed in there. But then they didn't list book 3 because book 2 was got a little too overly Christian, and they decided that I was not general market.
Oh, we can't have that. No, that's not allowed. No.
Cancel Jill Williamson. Now, I remember that scene. I also remember a very vivid scene where Aiken is captured and it basically is being forced into this kind of very creepy heathen ceremony. I know I want to go back and read that one. I forget if that was in book 2 or book 3. But that too, though, Jill, that's a realistic detail. Real knights, when they existed, would have gone to some kind of church. They probably would have called it a cathedral. They may have had a house gathering or something, but they tended to be, at least on paper, religious types of fellas. So it just makes sense then that a medieval fantasy world would reflect that. And medieval fantasy too, even though it is technically a subgenre of fantasy, there's so many subgenres that could also be labeled medieval fantasy. I would classify the original Blood of Kings trilogy as sort of high medieval fantasy. It's a completely separate world. There's no portals, nothing like that. It's a completely different dimension. You can't even really use the word dimension because it's a world all on its own. But I want to talk about some of those other genres in the next chapter and why readers love them so much. But we've talked already so much about Squire of Truth. We may as well just go ahead and read that description of this new fantasy novel, part of the Blood of Kings Legends series from Jill Williamson, Squire of Truth, which is also our third sponsor. Cole has journeyed far from his days as a stray stable boy in a distant mountain village. Haunted by failures on the battlefield, he seeks solace in music. But when the songstress he spent a fleeting evening with shows up at his doorstep, Cole may have gotten more than he asked for. Amidst the turmoil of a looming royal wedding and the threat of dark magic, Cole and Mistel must unravel the mystery of a brutal murder before they become the next targets in a deadly game of power. Return to the world of Eretz in Squire of Truth, a murder mystery romantasy from award-winning author Jill Williamson, and the first installment in the epic Blood of Kings Legends series. You can find that from Sunrise Publishing. We'll have all the links in our show notes for this episode 245, along with the amazing cover for Squire of Truth. Jill, chapter 3, why do readers still love medieval fantasy tales? Now, interestingly there, that story is marketed here as a murder mystery romantasy, which are like 2, possibly 3 subgenres that you can mix and match with medieval fantasy. Others maybe include cozy fantasy, or I don't know if there's a name for it, but royal drama medieval fantasy, where basically it's all about what you mentioned earlier, the relationship. So-and-so has to marry the prince that she doesn't want to, and then she runs away and discovers that she actually wasn't a princess. She was an orphaned peasant girl in hiding all along. And I just made that up. And actually, that sounds very interesting. Reverse the trope. But there's this kind of basically you transpose the Jane Austen human relationships to a medieval setting. And then you got yourself a sub-genre. But this is medieval fantasy, Squire of Truth, and yet also a murder mystery romantasy. How did all of those different genre types come together for this story? And why do readers love that kind of thing?
I hope readers will love it because it's different, a little bit different than what you tend to see in the medieval fantasy genre, that murder mystery element. I had several objectives with this story. It wasn't like I just thought, I'm this story's on my heart. No, I legitimately brainstormed how to write a story that would set off my author's 3 books. So the mission I was given was to write a novella. It was only supposed to be a novella with characters that would appear in these next 3 books as little cameos. So I was like, well, this is a big world. Why would these characters go all these places? And I thought, well, let's make them traveling musicians. And then, as I mentioned before, Susie was like, well, write about Cole. And I was like, Cole? He's what? Why Cole? And I started to think about it. And I was like, well, I could write about Cole. Sometimes it's fun when you're given a challenge and then you have to make it work. And that's kind of what happened. So I thought, well, what would it take to get Cole to be a traveling musician? So he's actually going to be a spy without spoiling, part of the Maraude, which was my spies in the original series. So but he has to prove himself first, and that's what this story was about. What would it take that Cole could prove not that he set out to prove it, but that he's actually one of the most reluctant heroes ever. But so he meets this girl who's very outgoing and is a singer, and he wants to just play music with someone. He's very introverted, and she's trying to basically bum a meal because she got the people were very stingy with their money after she performed with her band, and then she got robbed and she didn't have any food and her roommate was sick, and so she thinks, oh, this boy has money, maybe he'll buy me a meal, and so that's how he gets to know her. And then later when she goes home, her roommate has been killed and she doesn't know who to go to, so she thinks, I'm going to go there, and she goes and she's helped me, and so he gets thrown into this and they are going to try to find out what happened. And it turns into it happens right at the very end of From Darkness 1, my third book in the original trilogy, and so it kind of happens before that royal wedding that's going to be taking place. And so I tied some things in there, so it was really fun. I'd never written that kind of a whodunit before. I was trying to do a little bit of the Agatha Christie thing, and with my fantasy world it was very interesting. And then, obviously adding this romantic piece that I've never been just a straight romance writer, so that was new to me as well. But all the pieces are there. And fantasy, what's so great about a fantasy genre is that you can mash these different subgenres together, and it's fun to do so. And I really kind of made Armengard, my capital city, like a medieval London. And so then, most medieval fantasy stories don't really necessarily take place in a city like that. So that was kind of fun too, to be in this kind of just, crammed, overpopulated, muddy city and going through dark alleys and things like that. So it was fun.
Yeah, that's cool. I think you're right about that last point. When I think of a lot of medieval fantasy I've read, it's about exploring the forests and the mountains and just kind of the natural world, and maybe finding a castle or a dungeon or something like that, or a town. And you think of these little quaint towns with like the thatch roof inns and things like that. But I think, as readers, we come to these books because we a lot of us do live in cities, and increasingly we're living in cyberpunk cities, just very high tech but low life kind of atmosphere, and we're like, what? Like, how did we get to this? It's sort of that future shock. It's changing so fast, but not always in the best way. And these medieval stories kind of give us a way to go back in time a little bit to a little bit simpler age where it's not as complicated. Life is a little more arranged. But then, like you said, we go to these cities and we're like, oh yeah, they had overcrowding back then too. And they had, utility problems like we're having now, just very, very primitive utilities, of course, but still the same old kind of thing. And so it's like, okay, we're always going to have these sort of problems no matter what world or age we're living in. So then we start to see how the characters overcome these challenges and or just kind of live with them and just put up with it. And it kind of helps us get out of our heads a little bit. So, just a total side tangent. When I was in high school, I grew up in the city. I was never a country kid, even though I'm a Texan. I rode a horse like once. And so I was very much a city slicker. And then about halfway through high school, I went on this mountain hiking trip with Young Life, and it was like 5 days in the Rockies. We basically wore the same clothes for a whole week, slept in our clothes, slept very primitive. Everything you needed, you had to bring on a backpack, and they took a lot of things out. And so you're totally out of your comfort zone, just entirely. Like they said we couldn't even bring mosquito spray. Like we didn't have, room for that. And then what happened? Well, we ran into a giant swarm of mosquitoes that followed us for a whole day, of course. And you feel so vulnerable and you feel so alone. And then you get back to kind of your normal world and you're like, all these things that stress me out, all the things I get particular about, like I can deal with that. And I think that's what a lot of medieval fantasy does is we see these, everything is kind of simple. Like you don't have to remember your passwords or, you don't have to pay all these bills. But at the same time, you have so many creature comforts that you wouldn't have in these worlds, right? Like you didn't have deodorant in the medieval castle with 100 people crammed around you. So it makes you kind of thankful. It helps you kind of count your blessings. So, and of course, we're not always solving murder mysteries, like whodunit kind of things. So it helps to have a little bit more normal things to have to solve than that.
Zach, I think that's a big reason why readers still love medieval fantasy is because it feels grounded in a simpler history. And people largely now, I think, are longing for simplicity, even if they wouldn't like it if they got it, but they certainly like history. And they love this idea of a time that was real or a more magical version of a time that was real when there were actual knights and castles and the life of a peasant was a simple one, and yet there were adventures out there, maybe dragons in the dark forest and all of that. I think, too, medieval fantasy is poised for even more popularity because people are looking for those virtues. They're looking for things like chivalry, and yet they also want these stories with those broader strokes of good versus evil. So high fantasy, if it wasn't already very popular, I think will be even more popular because folks are longing for that kind of thing. And then ultimately, what I think people are longing for too is this ideal of an Arthurian king. I mean, that motif has been with so many generations for so long. This king who might come back and rule England someday, who reminds us of Jesus Christ. I mean, he is at the back of this story genre, probably even more clearly than some other fantasy genres. And people also just love that human drama. They love the simple ideas of good versus evil, or a world covered in darkness and all of that. And so medieval fantasy, I think, is going to stick around for quite some time, and there will be different versions of it. There'll be different subgenres within it. And Jill sounds like we'll be there to help with some of those, especially now with the Blood of Kings Legends series. Jill, this is by no means the only book in that series. You guys already have a release window set for book 2. There's even a cover. You can go ahead and see your book written with Andrew Swearingen, who's debuting with the Blood of Kings world. It's called Lord of Winter. What's next for Lord of Winter and any of these other books after that?
Yeah, so Andrew is writing about Eric Livna, who is up in Taftstown, my northernmost city that's close to the Ice Island prison. So my character Cole will be traveling that way with him for his own story, because I'm going to be writing a spin-off trilogy with Cole in it that takes place at the same time as Andrew's book. Andrew comes home. He has taken an army to war. He left with his army and followed my characters from the original trilogy to come south to Armengard and help take the throne for the king. And now he's going home with his army. And when he gets back, he's found a bit of trouble happening. Andrew's original idea was like a fantasy Cape Fear, like someone has come in and taken over while he's been away, and now he's got to take his town back because he's the new lord of Taftstown. And so Andrew's writing about that. And then I have two more coming this year. Kelly Fernlake is writing Lady Tara's story, the girl that got married off to the old guy. He's going to kick the bucket, and she's going to have her adventure and get her own story. So readers are excited. She's one of the most popular characters. And then Nikki Florica in September, her book will come out, and that's about Sir Rigel, who was another popular character, and his story. And so those 3 books come out this year. Andrew's is in April, and Kelly's is in July, and Nikki's is in September. And I'm excited. And they're all writing second books, so those will come out probably in 2027. My 3 new other books will come out in 2026. So we're going to have all kinds of fun Blood of Kings world romantasy adventures. Some of them are very pirate-like because they take place at sea. Some of them are very, in the cities, and then Andrews is in the frozen north. So all kinds of different fun stuff. We've been having a great time.
Jill, I think of all the authors, the fantastical authors who've wandered into this Gen joint, you have brought the most spoilers whatsoever. That's extraordinary. I was wondering if y'all were doing a rapid release, and I thought, are they going to do like books every quarter of this year? It turns out that yes, you are. And there's already sequels and spinoffs planned and all this. So congratulations. You have an entire medieval fantasy Blood of Kings verse here to share with fans. How have fans been responding to that so far? Obviously enough of a fan base to support this level of investment in the world you've made.
Well, it's only been a week, but they are excited to return to the world of Aretz. They want more. Of course, I left them on a bit of a cliffhanger, which I didn't mean to do, but I was assigned to get people into the world. It was supposed to be short, and there's going to be more.
You were just following orders.
I was, but it got longer. It ended up being 60,000 words, which is not a novella. So, but yeah, so they're excited to see. They want more. A couple of people have been like, Jill, and they still have to wait for more. But I do hope that they'll enjoy what's coming, because there's a lot of fun stuff. And there's some people who've said, well, why didn't you write about this character? So then I'm telling my authors, well, we have a couple requests from people. We didn't write this side character story. And so there's room for everyone. And the very loose plan is that when we decide we've written enough of these, I'm going to end this with more one or two more, I don't even know, Aiken and Vrel stories from their points of view as they are dealing with, because even though darkness was pushed back, there's still a lot of trouble. Some people like living in darkness. They want to stay that way. They want things to be the way it was before the king came back. There's a lot of evil going on out there still, and Aiken has his work cut out for him, which is, and he's trying to do good, and there's always going to be opposition. So that's the goal. We'll see what happens. Who knows what the years will bring, but that's the plan.
All Lord willing, of course. Well, Jill, it's great to get this level of info and preview of coming attractions. How can folks follow you on your social medias and keep up with the Blood of Kings Legends world building?
JillWilliamson.com is my website. All of my social media is linked there. I'm on Instagram, Jill Williamson author. I'm on TikTok, I'm on Facebook, I'm on all the places. So you can come find me. You can find my authors. You can go to Sunrise Publishing. They have the books in the stores, as well as Amazon. You can buy them from my store if you want paperbacks. I just sell the paperbacks. There's an audiobook that is amazing. These two darlingly talented British voice actors did the audiobook, and I adore it. And they sang for me because my characters sang. I wrote songs. I had so much fun. I'm a dork. I love it.
Oh, that's fantastic. 2 audiobook narrators.
Wow.
Now that's amazing. You don't and the songs. Yes. Some male audiobook narrators do better with female characters and vice versa. And some you're like, yeah, maybe you should have just said that in your normal voice. That's really cool. I look forward to hearing that too. Instead of blood voicing, you get narrator voicing. Jill, before we let you go, I sent you a link just now, and I'll put that in the show notes too. This is a little restoration I've been doing. I mentioned in our last episode that the speculative faith content is now restored at lorehaven.com. You can go there and see all those articles, but I'm going through some of these and polishing them up just a little bit, adding some relevant pictures and otherwise not touching them, leaving them as is. This link here is for your articles at Speculative Faith, going way back into the past. Some of these written even before Blood of Kings, book 1 by Darkness Hid was published. So listeners, if you want to go have a look at this earlier version of Jill Williamson, the pre-medieval version, go check those out. Some really great thoughts from her there from our olden golden past. And then, of course, share this episode of the podcast. Get the word out about Squire of Truth and these upcoming books. Share the link or just tell people about this episode 245 and tag Lorehaven on Facebook, Instagram, or X. Jill, you got some important work to do out there in the void, but certainly not a void of creativity. We wish you Godspeed and all the best travels as you continue to follow after the true king.
Thank you so much. I had a great time talking with you guys.
Thanks so much for joining us. Stephen, that was a lot of fun talking to Jill. And, just thinking about going on adventures, exploring the natural world that God has given us, and getting away from not only cities but screens and just all the techno shock that we've all gone through. Just recently on a road trip home, we were driving next to this truck, and I pointed it out to my son, and I said, "Hey, look at that! It's a tiny house." And he's like, "What?" And he didn't understand what I was speaking about, but on the back of this truck was essentially a camper, but it's literally a tiny house type camper that it was sitting in the truck bed that could then be unloaded somewhere and someone could live in. So kind of like a very primitive camper, but it's meant to be lived in at length somewhere. And my son was like, "Oh, you mean the shack on the back of that truck?" And I said, "Yeah, it's basically a shack." And I started thinking, the whole tiny home thing, that's been a revolution for a while, the simplistic living. I think a lot of these people are secretly fantasy readers, and especially all the RVs we see on the road, or the new thing I've seen now is these Jeeps with like the collapsible tent that goes on top of the Jeep. It's this really cool looking thing. It just looks like this black bar or something across the top. I think there are so many quiet fantasy readers out there because they love the same thing. They love going on adventures through mountains and forests and lakes. So to you, our listener, do you want to live in a medieval fantasy world like we've been talking about? Or would you just want to visit it with your shack or your camper or your RV and then just spend a couple days there and then come back like like a lot of stories where it's like a portal fantasy and they go back to London or something afterwards. So send us a note to podcast@lorehaven.com or find us on social media. Let us know which medieval fantasy world you would like to visit. And we're going to turn to some comments we got in a couple places now. So first, Stephen mentioned this article that Andy Sheehan had just written for Lorehaven about Brandon Sanderson's new book, Wind and Truth, the 5th book in the Stormlight Archive, where apparently he spends over 100 pages exploring a same-sex romance. And Andy, I think, really hit on something here about why this bothers a lot of faithful biblical Christians. Someone that we don't even know posted this in a very large readers group called Book Reviews for Christian Families with about 56,000 members on Facebook, and quite a few comments were thanking Andy for his observations and some of his insight. And just a lot of Christian readers just don't want this content, don't want these kinds of lifestyle choices, if you could say, glorified. Not like anyone wants to pretend this doesn't happen in the world, but it's very clear what Sanderson was doing with this book, at least from my perspective, Stephen, which is that he was trying to bring the real world, quote unquote, into his fantasy world. So he's no longer just creating a world with its own rules and systems and norms and cultures. He's trying to inject his own view of the world into this world. Now, obviously, all authors do this. But this is the thing that always bothers readers, and it doesn't matter what issue they are preaching to the reader. When you're preaching that this is important, this is how the world should be, and it's just very on the nose, readers don't really like that. It really doesn't matter what the issue is. So it's too bad to see that happen. I wish the best for Brandon Sanderson. I like all his books. I haven't gotten to this section of that book yet, but I'm sure I'll agree with Andy. So go check out his article, share your thoughts there as well. We are going to read one comment here from Caden, who wrote to us about the episode we published back in October about scary ghost stories in the Bible. And Caden says, quote, "I've been listening to Lorehaven every episode since October, and I already have a few favorites. I really enjoyed episode 233, which talks about the difference between evil and the appearance of evil. 235, about the scariest stories about aliens among us. 236, scary stories exposing human sin. 238, about dystopias I really enjoyed. And 242, about whether we should read newer fantasy or not. I'm really enjoying the podcast," unquote. Thanks so much, Caden, for that comment.
Back at you, Caden. I really enjoyed that comment. Common theme there. This holiday season, we do often hear scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago. So we'll talk about supernatural stories here as well as fantasy and science fiction. And especially with this new mini-series on the podcast, Jesus in Every Genre, we're going to explore how biblical worldview shapes each and every one of these subgenres. I'm really looking forward to more of these episodes, including next week's episode on Fantastical Truth. Once there was a family of 3 geeky little bears who decided to read this strange new genre called science fiction. The first reader, the traditional and wise Papa Bear, opened his 600-page hardcover showing rivets on the cover, read 2 chapters, and then rumbled his approval. "This science fiction is hard," said he. The second reader, the curious and considerate Mama Bear, opened her 220-page paperback that featured rocket ships in the background of the cover behind a swooning couple. Then she read only a few pages before sighing in contentment. "This science fiction is soft," said she. What sort of books did they read? And what is the difference? What is soft science fiction? We'll be joined by Echo Nova author Clint Hall. I'm looking forward to discovering Jesus in every genre, and I think this series too will help readers as we're finding agendas in books where they ought not be, as we're finding just cringe books out there from all sorts of authors. I think it's great to expect excellence in these stories. If a book is telling you, I'm science fiction, you need to know what you're getting into. If a book is telling you I'm medieval fantasy, well, what is that? Does the book live up to expectations? Raise your expectations for not only beauty in the stories and excellence and goodness, but also truth, biblical truth, as we continue to seek and find Christ, our author's fantastical truth.